I'm an author, and I'm here tonight because this is part of what I determined a long time ago is my life's work. I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, which is a racially complicated place, maybe more so than others. And I was lucky enough to have educators who showed me how important it was to get involved and stay involved. And I have stayed involved. And it is the reason why I became a teacher, was because I saw that as being the best way to make the biggest impact on the community where I live, most particularly Martha's Vineyard, where I've been for 10 years, and where I hope to stay forever.
Hi, my name's Eric Blake. I am the police chief for the town of Oak Bluffs. 33 years in law enforcement, 17 as chief. And I've also served 10 years as the president of the Martha's Vineyard chapter of the NAACP. So I'm a white male, European, and I'm happy you invited me. So thank you.
My name is Tripp Hopkins. I am a former student of Martha's Vineyard Regional High School. I used to be a senior. My pronouns are he and him, and I am an African American. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Amanda Finizio. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm white. I have 50% Italian background and about half mix of English and Irish. I am currently an 8th grade teacher. I teach social studies at a charter school in Framingham called Christa Mcauliffe Charter School. And I also lead our school's anti-racism community action team. And I'm hoping to pursue a career as a school administrator. I was excited to be part of this panel to talk a little bit about why it's important for me as a white woman to understand my identity better in the racial landscape we're living in and really explore my biases and blind spots and the racist thoughts that I have so that I can move towards a solution. And my goal is to work with other white people to help them explore those things as well.
Good evening. My name is John Forte. I am from Brooklyn, New York, originally. My pronouns are he, him, his, African-American, male. I am a singer-songwriter turned activist, predominantly as a result of, or as a consequence of my personal experiences with the criminal justice system, when in 2001, I was convicted of a first-time nonviolent drug offense that resulted in a 14-year prison sentence. My sentence was commuted. About 7.5 years into that sentence. I came home in 2008. I've been home ever since. I moved to Martha's Vineyard full-time in 2015, and this is where I live with my wife and our daughter and our unborn child who's expected any day. It is a pleasure to participate in this community conversation. Thank you for having me.
Hi, everyone. My name's Graysen Kirk. I am a current upcoming sophomore at the Martha's Vineyard Regional High School. I identify as she, her. I'm white. My background is a lot, kind of a mutt, mostly European and then some Abenaki. I have lived on the island for 7 years. I'm originally from New Hampshire. And I am a student activist for many causes. But right now, and most importantly this, I put together the protest a few days ago on Monday at 5 Corners, and I hope to continue my work into my future, where I hope to become a civil rights and human rights attorney.
Thank you, Graysen. Before you get off, since I left you off, you might as well start. I'll make it up to you. Can you talk a little bit to the audience and to the panelists about what, what was your thinking behind that protest? And what was your thinking behind it, the process of putting it together, and your thoughts about the outcome?
So obviously hearing the news about George Floyd and seeing that horrific video, it was paralyzing for me because I felt like I needed to do something and I needed to help in some way, but I couldn't really because we live in such an isolated community, especially with COVID happening. It's isolating us even more. So I heard about the riots and the protests and everything happening nationwide, and I heard about the Colin Kaepernick Like Me is happening around June 1st nationwide for around 7 minutes. Ours was 8 minutes and 46 seconds, the exact time George Floyd was kneeled on. And so I wanted to bring it locally and give other people who feel like they didn't have anywhere to voice their opinion a platform to do that. Mathea was a huge help. She helped me navigate it, and thankfully I put it together and word spread fast, and it was, I think, a really good success. Yeah, it was peaceful and it was meaningful and it was inspiring to see that many wide range of youth to old, elderly, and also all different kinds of races unifying, and all of the gratitude at the protest, random people coming up to me, and the gratitude afterwards. My phone has been blowing up since with just random people expressing to me their thanks. And I hope to continue this work, and I hope that by the end of tonight we reach something that can work in the direction of helping create change and inspiring youth to derail the systematic racism that upholds our country.
That's great. And just to follow up, and maybe between you and Tripp, you can answer this. When I was looking at, the participants, it looks like we have close to 100 people. And I think the high majority are probably adults. Mm-hmm. So, can you guys talk a little bit about how do we get young people more involved on the island?
I mean, personally, I think it's really just about motivating. I mean, everyone knows that teenagers are a little lazy, especially in these times, and especially for people who feel like it's not affecting them directly, because I feel like as an island, we like to forgive ourselves and let ourselves off and make an excuse that we aren't affected by this, but it really affects everybody. So I think just finding the right ways to get people involved, or at least educated, so they want to learn more, they want to do more. I think that's the best way, and I think the youth is our best hope, honestly. Generations before have failed to derail that, and I think that it's time that it changes.
Yeah.
Going off of what Graysen was saying, I think a very important way for people to be able to make a change and really awareness to be, brought up is just really knowing exactly like that when you state yourself as, when you state yourself as an ally, being ready for the change that will come, because it's very easy to say that, hey, I'm an ally, I'm going to support this cause, and then the next day forget about it. But the best way is to become mentally ready yourself that, hey, this change is going to come if we keep on fighting for it. I'm ready for this change to come for my fellow African-American people in this country and in the world. And I think after all this happens, a lot is going to change, and just being ready for that to happen and being educated for when that does happen, I think is the most important thing that you can do, going off what Graysen was saying. So,
Tripp, can you talk a little bit about what it's been like for you being raised on Martha's Vineyard, a predominantly white community, as an African-American male?
Of course. The first thing that is like the main big difference I really see is just a difference between how my interactions with people during the summer and during the winter. During the winter, our population, as you know, gets a lot smaller, and a lot of the people that visit during the summer are African American and Black, and may come from areas where, you know, African American culture is very rich and plentiful. And I just feel a completely different experience when, you know, just talking to people around town during summer compared to the winter. I just feel like I'm a little bit more in touch with my own heritage and the people that are like me. But what's also interesting about the off season is that it may not be obvious, but there's little nuances that just, you know, I like to call them like microaggressions that people may not realize that what they're saying may be, well, not racist in a way, but maybe generalizing or stereotypical in a way. Like, one thing I get from a lot of people that doesn't mean any harm at all in their head, but like, can I touch your hair, stuff like that. Just, you know, little things that you wouldn't say to somebody of your same race. You just, you know, think it's okay because you're not being quote unquote racist. And I think that, especially growing up on Martha's Vineyard, it's a very liberal place. I feel everybody here has a good head on their shoulders when it comes to civil rights and knowing that everybody's built equally. But just those will always be around, especially in a culture that's, you know, not as well educated as it needs to be. And that's very apparent now as these crazy things are going on in the culture, that we're not simply, white America isn't as educated on civil rights issues as they thought they were. And that's why things like this are happening. And that's why I feel, living in a predominantly white area in America, that still, even when I'm living with people who will devote their lives, their careers, and everything into ending racism, you can still see those small amounts of just nuances that might stick by. And actually, in 11th grade, I wrote an essay about this, about how it was really affecting me in high school. And just being able to really like write that down and like put it through my brain that, hey, this is happening, made me myself more aware. So I think growing up as an African-American student on Martha's Vineyard has been a very interesting and eye-opening experience that I wouldn't be able to see if I lived someplace else. And I feel lucky to live here, but as I said, there's just little bits and pieces everywhere spread across America.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Tripp.
No problem.
Thank you, Tripp. I mean, and I think your point, you know, that you were talking to around implicit bias is also something very important for us to keep in mind when we have these conversations, because we do often think that, well, I'm not actively or consciously contributing to the perpetuance of any type of behaviors that would lend to systemic racism, but, you know, unwittingly we are. And so having knowledge of that and being mindful of that is critically important. We have a question for the panelists from Ms. Schubert. What is the relationship, or in your opinion, what is the relationship between systemic racism and public education in the United States? And I'll start there. It's a two-part, so I'll go there. And Matea, I see you're ready.
Well, I was just talking about this the other day, and I wasn't aware of this, so I thought this was pretty interesting. The proliferation of private schools in this country didn't really start to happen until after Brown versus Board of Education. So those of us who are dealing with the education system, trying to make the public education system work, we are navigating a historically racist system that has been absolutely impacted by racist policy. So the fact that, you know, schools lost funding and people moved out and they took their money with them and they sent their kids to private schools, that really wasn't even an option until Brown versus Board of Education. So systematic racism is absolutely tied into the fiber of our schooling system. Same with after the Civil Rights Acts were passed, that's when they started building the highways, and you know, white folks started taking their tax dollars and moving out of the cities and divesting in schools and in communities where people of color lived. So it's incredibly important, if we're going to talk about dismantling systemic racism, that we look at the way it was built into our current public education system.
So Amanda, I'll follow up with you. Thank you, Mateo. As an eighth grade, you're both educators. I'm interested to hear, well, in what ways does the education system help address race-based inequities? And in what ways might it either intentionally or unintentionally exacerbate those inequities?
Yeah. I think I would say there's a lot of harm happening in our education system currently. And it actually takes active examination by all of us to really make those changes. And the schools that I think are moving towards those things are the ones that are doing a really close examination of their practices, their curriculum, the identities of the faculty, and the blind spots and biases that teachers bring. And, as Tripp was describing microaggressions, teachers do those all the time. I know that I've said and done microaggressions, and so it's this constant reflective practice. I think the benefit is just education. I think that education is such a crucial tool for everybody, and whether it's students of color or white students, especially learning. I mean, I teach social studies, so I'm impartial to history, but understanding the history of our country. Mateo was talking about some of the historical moments in our educational system. If we don't understand that, we don't understand how we got to where we are today.
Thank you, Amanda. John, I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on this as well, because there's a real juxtaposition between, some of, the experiences that you've had in your life, but your formal education. I mean, you went to one of the most elite boarding schools in the country. And, what did you see? What did you experience, there as an African-American male at Exeter, right? Was it Exeter or Andover?
Exeter.
Exeter.
Mm-hmm. Sure. I'd love to touch on it. My experience coming from Brownsville, Brooklyn to Exeter, New Hampshire, from 14 to 18 years, it took place during the formative years for me. That was essentially where I grew up. Prior to Exeter, I did not know what it felt like to feel like someone in the minority, because all I saw were folks of color, folks who looked like me for the most part, with the exception of educators and law enforcement. And when I went away to New Hampshire, there were out of the student body of 1,000 total, there were probably 60 of us, African-American kids. There were other young Latinos and Latinas so we had some, we had a probably equal, if not a little bit more of a Black and brown population to each other, but still very, very small compared to the aggregate. And I learned pretty early on that when I used my voice in primarily white rooms, that I had to be aware of the fact that there were some folks who were going to take what I was saying as, well, this is how all Black people feel. This is how all people of color feel. And it's an interesting paradigm. It's an interesting phenomenon. What happens when the minority uses his or her voice, and the lenses that we employ on a day-to-day basis as people of color in those rooms. It might not always be relatable to the other folks in that room. I guess I say all that to say that from a very, very young age, I learned the importance of patience, the importance of compassion, the importance of understanding. Were it not for those attributes, I think I could have gone off the rails more than a number of times because of the pressures, because of what it feels like to be a person of color in America. that's what that speaks to. It's you know, I know that we'll unpack so much more of it throughout this conversation, but you know, it's just the tip of the iceberg. I am very, very pleased that that you, Dakir, have I know taken a very, very concerted effort to get a diverse group of people around the table here this evening, and I think that that's just critical to any sort of advancement of community and culture. So thanks.
Well, thank you for joining us, John and I. You know, I have to give, you know, it was a joint effort, Amy and I, you know, and it was the origin of it, you know, and honesty being, you know, Amy asking me a very simple question, you know, in all honesty about, you know, checking in, because that's what we do when we're in the office together. We check in and we connect. And, you know, I wasn't doing well. You know, I was certainly out of sorts, and I felt isolated on this island, and I didn't know what to do. But, you know, it was such a simple idea that, you know, Amy came up with, and something that we both knew would be meaningful. And, you know, and just beginning this, you know, as a mechanism to keep our community connected, it just shows us that there's so much more opportunity for us to not address these situations in silos, whether we're affiliated with different organizations within the community or for individuals. We do have the mechanisms and the platforms to come together and have these dialogues. You know, one of the questions that came in, I want to pose it to you, Chief Blake, was from Jonah Madoff, and I'm interested because he's asking how to challenge social segregation that exists in our communities. And, you know, for me, as someone that moved here from off island, you know, I've heard, you know, there's a lot of the up island, down island, and there's a lot of, especially what I believe to be prejudice toward, you know, Oak Bluffs and, you know, that particular town and the references. And I just wonder, you know, in thinking about that broadly in relation to our island community and the town for which you serve as the chief, you know, how do you see that impacting our, you know, ability to really understand the differences, you know, throughout this island? And what does that say to you about the work that needs to be done with regard to our tolerance and the inequities that, you know, are clearly present but not necessarily spoken to?
There we go. Thank you so much, Kirk. Yeah, if you're talking about the historically, like I've been here for 51 years for the most part, and so Oak Bluffs has always been known as the nightlife town, the party town. It's also been known as the historically Black community. So when I was growing up, it was just that up island was so rural, and down island was, you know, people didn't interact like they do now. There was obviously no Facebook, and there was no cell phones and everything. So it was through sports and that kind of stuff that you even talk to other kids, you know, in other towns. But the cultural difference, you're right. The Oak Bluffs is known for, it's actually in the African American Museum in Washington, D.C. is one of the significant geographical locations for African Americans. Yet it took us how long to get the Civil War plaques off the monument? So you talk about that little bit, Tripp was talking about it, that little bit of undercurrent, right? So that plaque was put up there, and I forgot what it was now, 1927, and it's honoring the Confederates. So I consider them traitors, and, you know, they weren't soldiers. That's my feeling. And I've been saying this for almost 2 years now. You know, my plight as the president of the NAACP is nothing like walking across the bridge in Selma. But still, people are, you look at the blogs on the paper, people still, I'm going to let the protests happen because I took the plaques down. That's a very heavy statement. You know, that's some real undercurrent. And talking about people, the implicit bias or the unconscious bias, people say things like that thinking that they're just talking, but it really has, it holds weight, and that's what we need to work at. Tripp is right, and John is absolutely right. It's identifying and calling out when those little things happen. Because you're right, that Martha's Vineyard is a very special place. It's a place that would allow a white man that's a police chief to actually become the president of the NAACP. So we're different in a lot of ways, but there is still that undercurrent. There's always work to be done. So I hope I answered your question about that. I could talk for hours about law enforcement and civil rights, and so let's.
Well, maybe, this is a good opportunity to parlay into, so, that work and, in the context of who we are and what we do. So what's the work that needs to be done on the end of law enforcement? And then we can talk about, the work that needs to be done in other spheres. Not that there's overlap, we know, but we are talking about an agency. So what's that?
Sure. What you're seeing now across the country, where, like today, I told you earlier that I did a kneel-in with all the other police chiefs. We got together and we wrote that letter to the paper. Well, that's not unique to Martha's Vineyard, but it's unique going across the country. After Rodney King happened, you didn't see a lot of police officers or police departments banding together with protesters, and now you're starting to see that. What we need from law enforcement leaders is to better hiring, talk about your police departments fitting the community you're serving, right? We need to learn to fish in a different pool, to a different pond, to get people to come into law enforcement. We need what's called a post program. We need to be able to decertify police officers, and we also need a culture to change in law enforcement where you're held as a hero when you knock that person off of someone's neck or you tell on somebody, as opposed to being held up to a higher standard when you keep quiet about it. There's got to be that fundamental change in law enforcement. It's easier, I'll admit, it's easier in a small department where we know everyone so intimately that something like that shines brightly and you can deal with it. When you have systemic racism throughout the judicial system and throughout police departments, huge police departments, all it takes is one sergeant that's in charge of a whole group that happens to have racial tendencies, and he influences a whole group, and it's systemic throughout the whole place. It's there's fundamental changes from the way we train police officers. Right now, we need to train police officers in proper tactics, how to stay safe on, because it can be a dangerous job. But when I look at the academy curriculum across the state, where they go in to teach them, they have about a 3-hour block on community policing and problem solving. So they have a 30-hour block on how to shoot your gun, which hopefully you'll never have to do in your whole career, but you only have a 3-hour block on how to interact with your community. That's the changes that need to happen. You need law enforcement leaders to stand up and publicly fire and get rid of what we call, I said it earlier, bad apples. And law enforcement, I'll say it again, it's not a job where we can afford to have bad apples. So you need to find that really quickly, and you need to get rid of it really quickly. And I just, we keep the whole, it's so cliche, but it's so true. You take a few steps up and then something is horrendous that happened sets us back. And now when you have the protests, the peaceful protests, and other groups are infiltrating it, causing the violence and the looting. I saw a symbol today or yesterday on Facebook where it's okay to be anti-looting, pro-police, and for the movement of equal rights. It's okay to be all those things, and you need the intestinal fortitude to stand up and say it's okay to be all those things.
Just really quickly, because I do know I want to spread some questions over to the other panelists, but John, I don't want to miss this moment. You talked about, your feelings of compassion and understanding when you spoke about, when you were speaking earlier, and those feelings, how does that play into, your thought or sentiment toward law enforcement based on what you've experienced as a man of color in the criminal justice system in America?
Yeah, so I appreciate Eric's comments just now. Some thoughts were running through my head as I heard them, particularly about the community outreach. And I wondered how do we in the modern era promote this community engagement, the throwback notion to a constable on patrol, right? A cop, where you had to walk the beat and get familiar with the folks in the neighborhood that you were protecting and serving. With how do you reconcile that with the militarization, with the clear militarization of the force, whether that's with the vehicles, whether that's with the armor, whether that's with the language and or the perceived attitude. I think that the optics on the one hand of saying, we need to be more responsible with regard to our relationship building in the community. I respect that message through and through. Yet the continued optics again and again are anything but warm, ingratiating community building. And so we're existing on an island. As the police chief, I do wonder, do you have the wherewithal and the parameters to introduce some of those old school notions of having your officers walk the beat, of having your officers do community oriented work to see their citizens as more than just perpetrators or otherwise? And again, I know that I realize that you asked me a question, and I'm now flipping this question back to Eric, and I hope that that's okay.
That's amazing.
I like how you did that. Yeah, I mean, whether it's something as small as getting on the bike and interacting with people, or bringing in training like we do with diversity training we've done, or whether it's having policies in place that, like anti-bias policing policies. It's also hiring people from your community, making sure they have roots in the community. And you're right, it's part of it, and I don't want to get on a millennial thing, but part of it too is that it is a generational thing. Some people just don't interact well with people, and we have an old expression, you're not going to text your way out of this conversation. You need to actually interact with people, right? So it's always, me personally, I'm always trying to better my police department, and always trying to have engagement within my community, whether it's encouraging officers to help out with the food pantry, or serve at the Council on Aging, or to make sure that they appear at the community events we have, like the Battle in the Bluffs at the basketball, at the basketball courts. Just for an example, it's constantly, like in my office, we have a message board up that's a electronic message board that has every event that's going on in town, and the sergeant is responsible for making sure that somebody shows up there and shows their face and actually is part of being visible at those. So yes, that will answer your question. Someone has not muted you. Yeah.
I just wanted to speak to this a little more. There's been some really great research that's been out about police reform. It's been going on for a long time, but it's definitely, coming to the forefront. And I think it's, really important for us to think about a different model that includes professionals responding to the type of problems that are at hand. We ask police officers to respond to everything from a dog that is in the middle of the road, to a man that's about to kill himself, to someone being abused, to someone having a breakdown. And all of those things are all being put on police officers to navigate with this training, where they really, all they know how to do is shoot their gun, right? They've been trained. And so they're responding in the way they've been taught to respond. But the reality is they shouldn't even be at that place. That place doesn't require a police officer. That place requires a social worker, or a domestic violence advocate. It requires, someone who understands mental health. So it's really, I think in this moment, so important to look at And I think on Martha's Vineyard, we really have an opportunity to, because we know each other, because we're a community. It's not that racism doesn't exist here, but what does exist here is this real sense of understanding of who we are. And I think that we can start to look at who's responding to these calls and why, and who would be the best person to answer a certain situation, rather than it necessarily being a police officer with a gun.
Good point.
John?
I just wanted to just circle back and put a little bit of a bow on the thought, just to say that it's my firm belief that when, post the civil rights era, when folks of color started to join law enforcement, people of color who were not on the force had to naturally disavow ourselves of some of the skepticism, because we had folks who looked like us, who and therefore we had to invest in hope. We had to invest that well, my cousin's an officer, and so while we know that systemic racism might underpin the force or the laws or the country itself, we've got family who also wear blue. And it's very tempting for us to see or to get seduced with what we're seeing with the protests, and to lean on the aggressions, on what keeps us tuned in, which happens to be referred to as the riots, the violent aspects of the protest. But again, it's my firm belief that people of color who've had to shelter so much of the burdens of systemic racism have had to really believe that the force, that law enforcement, that the system itself could be better. So I think that's just a long roundabout way of saying that
legitimacy.
The tensions are 100%. 100%. This conversation does matter. It's not for naught. It's not in vain that progress has been made, but there is still so much more to go. And Eric, that's something that you said, and I just wanted to not solely lay to just not answer the question. So thanks.
Sure. But without monopolizing, you're right, John. It's that word legitimacy. People. We all as a society agree on laws that are passed by legislators, and that the law is just. Not only does the law have to be just in everyone's eyes, the people enforcing the law have to be legitimate. And so if you're enforcing the law unevenly, then a group of people don't consider the people enforcing it legitimate, right? So that's where procedural justice comes in, where if you treat everyone the same, and you actually enforce the law equally, and people have a say, and whether it's, you can go all the way down to bail reform and diversion programs. As long as the people that are enforcing the law are seen as legitimate, then people follow the law, and that's So it's turning into a law class. I
want to get it back to, I want to hear Graysen and Tripp's thoughts on what you guys have been discussing, because it is very important. So Graysen, do you want to chime in?
Yeah. Just on this topic, I think police and law enforcement play obviously a big role in this, because this protest is about law enforcement. But I think the thing that a lot of people don't look at as well too is the criminal justice system. I think it's easy for us to target the police, which they are obviously at fault, but there's a whole process behind it, and there's not a specific face to the entity of the criminal justice system, so we can't really place the blame on them. But it's really it's it's an insanely huge problem. The incarceration rates, I mean, 1 in 3 every Black male has either been in prison or will go to prison. And those numbers are catastrophic in just the percentage of the population that the African American people make up. And so I think that while also working with law enforcement, we need to work in the criminal justice system as well. Just targeting all the specific points along the process that happens, because if we're being real, there's people here who and people in the system who get like John, he got 14 years for a nonviolent drug offense, and there's people who are getting out on months for much farther severe crimes. So I think that that's a really important thing that we also need to target as a society. Yeah, I'll hand it over to Tripp.
Tripp. Good. I'm unmuting you and you're muting. There you go.
I should work now. We
There you
kind of did So what I've been thinking, something that has been really interesting, especially since I like to spend a lot of my free time, since we have a quarantine, online, is there have been a lot of abbreviations and hashtags that people have used to support the movement. And one of those that was very common was ACAB, which stands for, the way to use it is all cops are bastards. And people are really taking that and they're kind of just, they're changing what it means. And because of that misinformation, that gap, that how people are using it, it's making it seem like, hey, we're calling everybody that is a police officer someone terrible. If you're a police officer, that's awful, and less focusing on the system as a whole that allows for these terrible cops to pop up and do and cause scenes like what has been going on right now. I really agree with what Graysen was saying with the whole criminal justice aspect needing to change. That's a whole nother side of the storm that's going on that isn't getting as much light as needs to be, because we're focusing mostly on the cops themselves and what goes on in the field and not what happens after that happens. Because what a lot of people don't know is that there are ways that even when stuff like that happens, that we can still fix it later on. And by fixing both parts of the system, we can open it up to a new idea, the new idea that's being passed down now, that everybody is built equally and that people will be treated the same way, despite race, because that's written down, 14th Amendment. But as we can see, it's simply not that way. And that just goes to show that just writing stuff down, just saying stuff isn't really making that much of a difference. The education is a part that is really needed. And going back to the whole criminal justice part I was talking about and what Graysen was saying, the 1 in 3 African American males being imprisoned in their lifetime, it's scary to think that, hey, me or two of my brothers are gonna end up, probably, according to statistics, gonna end up in prison at one time in our lives. And just thinking about that and thinking about what someone who might be close to me might have to go through if this criminal justice system doesn't change, because there are many times when someone can get, arrested or brought in a situation, and, the first thing a police officer might think when seeing the situation, especially if it involves an African American, is, without like I was talking about, the subconscious, they may tense up a little bit. They may be more, lenient to reach for their gun, to be a little bit more tense in the situation, especially in more, urban areas. And the whole criminal justice part of it after that needs to be strong in order to protect people that have already been persecuted by the system. Because a lot of, because like we're saying, 1/3 of African American males have already been affected by the system. And once that stands, once that's there, it never goes away. It's a mark that remains. And just by fixing that part that we're focusing on right now won't get rid of what has already happened to people. So I thought what Graysen said about the whole criminal justice aspect of this movement is important too.
I have a question for you, Tripp, in follow-up to that. So, and it came in through the chat box. So if you had the opportunity, if you had the attention of, a white person in a position to influence an institution, that's fueled by systemic racism, and they're resistant to understanding that connection, they're resistant to understanding, systemic racism and its role, what would you say? What would you say to them to make it clear, to help them see?
Could you say that question again, just the beginning part?
So basically, if you had the attention of, a white person that was resistant to understanding, the role that systemic racism plays in all of this, what would you say to them?
Well, what I would say, I feel a lot of those people that don't realize what systemic racism is really going on is those people that like to go around and saying all lives matter during movements like these. And the main thing people need to realize is that Black Lives Matter is a movement, and this systematic racism that's going around, it's not saying that we don't think Black people in this movement doesn't think that all lives don't matter. It's like saying, hey, the rainforest in Amazon is burning down. And then someone saying, save the trees in the Alpines. It's like, it's two different things, and both are obviously important, but one is at hand right now and being threatened currently, and the other is something that should obviously always remain the same, but is not being threatened at this current moment. I think that systemic racism, it's hard. It would be hard to explain to someone like that, because like I was saying earlier when I was talking about the little nuances, I didn't realize some of those nuances myself as an African-American man until I wrote it down on a piece of paper and handed it in as a school grade. And I think that to really understand those nuances, to truly understand the systemic racism, because anybody can tell you what they think about what's going on, but to truly, I think it's hard for me to speak for another race, but as someone, if I were going to this blind and ignorant and maybe like as a white person, I would say that to understand what's going on, you need to physically see it. You need to talk to African Americans and people of color, people who have gone through, and not just only African Americans too, because obviously this is African Americans are the ones being persecuted right now, but we need to understand that this happens and systemic racism is a thing in our country, and people sadly will be discriminated against depending on what group they are. The LGBTQ plus community, all the other communities. I had a really interesting conversation with my Asian American friend about this whole entire situation and what he thinks of stuff like that. And what he's been saying is that, yeah, I really support Black Lives Matter. And I'm thinking that this is he's thinking Black Lives Matter, this movement right now is a really good catalyst to start a new era change for, all races, because there's so many not little at all, big problems in this country that have to do with race or immigration or different skin color, different nationality, just the differences in people, that by, for example, by being able to educate white people by having real experiences would become less and less and disappear over time just through education. But to really sum up what I think white people should be able to go through in order to really understand the systemic racism is be able to talk to African American people in their community and just listen to their stories. And instead of going into that conversation with the mentality of a debate, going to that conversation with the mentality of you're just trying to educate yourself and hear more information about somebody who knows a lot more about being Black than you. So that's what I have to say about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Tripp. And I'm interested in hearing the perspective of Amanda and Matea as two educators who I know have, teach a diverse cross-section of students, but what are your thoughts? So maybe Amanda, we'll start with you, and Matea, we'll go to you afterwards.
Yeah, sure. No, Tripp, I love hearing you talk about that. And I think I also was just appreciative of you sharing your perspective and mindful of the fact that as white people, we have to educate ourselves, but we also can't force Black people to tell us what to do. So it's our turn to do that learning. So I appreciate you sharing that with all of us here as an opportunity, but so that we can take that and go on and do our own learning. And I think that, as a white person, we have to, so systemic racism was mentioned as a problem, and all of that is connected. Police brutality goes back to slaveholders, and it goes back to the KKK and white supremacy groups developing after Reconstruction. These are, and the FBI investigating and infiltrating the Black Panther Party and Martin Luther King. These are historical things that have happened from powerful institutions in our country. So I think that as white people, we have to, I love that you said, listen to someone who understands more about what it means to be Black. And I think that right now, and I'm both trying to help other white people think about this and do it myself at the same time. It's so important to be listening. I have to stop talking. I'm someone, Dakir knows I like to talk a lot, but I have to stop talking. I have to listen. And look to people who want to be sharing the information. There's plenty of books and movies and articles and people of color who are talking online. I don't have to call up my Black friend in a time where Black people are facing extreme trauma and say, hey, tell me everything that it means to be a Black person right now. That's work that I have to do. And I would say the most important thing for me is constantly remembering to be humble about this work. And it's really hard. Anti-racism work is really hard, and white people are very uncomfortable doing it because we haven't had to think about race as much or in the same way. And our muscle for thinking and talking about it is a lot weaker. So, it's a process of slowly building up that muscle. And that means you have to constantly be looking inward, constantly be accepting feedback about things that you maybe have done that wasn't correct, that a system brought into you that you can fix. So I think it's a lot about introspection and a lot about listening.
Thank you, Amanda.
Well, Amanda really, said a lot about the work that white folks have to do, and it's and I'm not sure whether or not that was your question, Dakir. I think that it is important for us to understand that it's hard. It's going to be hard, and we're going to mess up, and we're going to, make mistakes, and we're going to feel bad, and I think thinking that you're not going to feel bad is the first mistake. And it's not that you should, you should feel bad and this is all on you. This is hard. People feel bad no matter who we are. We all feel bad. This is awful. But I think what's important to know is that white folks have the option not to feel bad about it, right? White folks have the option to look the other way and go on with their lives and go back to normal, right? Because white folks are the default. It's like in the crayon box when you have the skin color, right? Whose skin color is that? So white people don't have to think about that. They just don't, that is not a reality for them if they don't want it to be. And if you want it to be a reality as a white person, it's going to be hard for you. And that's okay. It's hard for not white folks all the time. So the fact that you have a choice, that's a lifelong thing for you. You're going to have to consistently make that choice. You're going to have to come back to that choice again and again and again. And as a teacher, as an educator, you're really going to have to come back to that choice because our curriculums and our school system is rife with racism and systemic racism. It's built into all pieces of it. And so as a teacher, especially as a white teacher, you have to be ready to look at it every single day and ask, is this, where is the racism here? Where is the implicit bias? Where is the explicit bias? How is this student going to feel? And not only that, what am I teaching these white kids? Even if I have a class full of white kids, it doesn't matter. I'm still responsible for teaching them how to be racist. If I'm not taking that on, if I am not looking at that as an educator, it's constant. And so I think that's a really, really important thing. So for your just, if you're not an educator and you're a white person, it's constant. And if you're an educator, it's even more constant because you're responsible for bringing knowledge to the forefront to your students every day.
Thank you for that. And it feeds really nicely into a question that I got from Kendall about, Tripp or Graysen's opinions on, our current faculty in relation to diversity. What do you guys think about your peers, their thoughts specifically being on an island that is sheltered? And, do you feel like there's enough cultural representation of our population of students in the school? And, and how does that impact our educational experience if you are challenged by that? So essentially, in short, do we have enough diversity? Do we need to be thinking more about diversity in our classrooms? And, and if so, what's been the impact on that in your educational experience thus far? Do you want to kick us off, Graysen?
Yeah, so I don't know if all of you remember, but originally I said I was from New Hampshire. I still go up there almost every month with the exception of this COVID outbreak that's messed that up a little bit. But growing up, I didn't really notice it as much until I came here or I went back there. But where I live and where I notice most of America is at, there's maybe, I went to a football game once in New Hampshire and it was a homecoming game. So the whole, a bunch of high school kids were there, all families were there. I look up into the stands and coming to football games on the Vineyard, I thought it was going to be just the stands there, but it was completely white. I don't want to categorize them as redneck, but there was a lot of white people, and I really only know of 5 people that attend that high school up there. So to me, the diversity here is immense. Just referencing that back to my hometown. But I think it's nationwide, we need to educate, I think, and that's how I really have my understanding now, is from the educators in the past. Mathea played a huge role in my understanding now, so as Jonah. I remember reading a book about slavery in Jonah's class, and that really changed my perspective. And recently, Miss Goethals, all of them. But we have to remember our community is unique in that way. Miss Goethals brought to light that in the biggest history or textbooks, there's only 20 pages on slavery at most. And that's a huge part of our history. And I think we, as the textbook writers or the people who are in charge, they feel guilty, or it's about their pride. So we suppress or we hide that part of our history in a way to not deal with it because it's hard for us. But I think just talking about it more and being more open about it, and I guess checking your privilege constantly and thinking, just being aware of that, not as any race, but specifically for white people, just checking their privilege and also not taking offense to when someone, I think we jumped into defense mode when people start talking about the racism in our country, because we're constantly thinking they're going to accuse us, oh, we don't want to be racist, we don't want to be called that, but really it's a wide discussion, and we need to stop being so closed-minded about it and I guess beating around the bush. Yeah, that's just my thoughts on it.
Yeah. At the high school at MVRHS, I feel on the surface level there is, while there may not be diversity in the student body, like compared to some other places, I feel like there is a lot of diversity in ideals. I know that we have a large Brazilian student population, which is really cool, something you don't see in a lot of high schools. And for African Americans, I feel like we're a little underrepresented on the island as a whole, but I feel that the school does a fine job of holding that up in kind of an academic and school way. But something that has to do with diversity that I feel like is a consequence of having a low African American population on the island is what some of the Caucasian students might, say or stuff like that. I do have friends like that, mostly online, but sometimes even in real life, well, that are white and say the N-word because they're just not, like, it's hard because I know those people. I've known a lot of those people a long time, and I know that some of the people that say that, they don't mean to be racist. They don't, when they say that, I know it sounds completely whack, but they don't think they're being racist. They don't, it doesn't click in their mind that, hey, that's not a word you can say. And that's simply because of the fact that that they don't have black people surrounding them when they're growing up. There's no consequences, well, socially consequences for them saying something like that in that certain scenario. And because of that, like, I feel the diversity of the island is strong in some sense, but just because of the actual population diversity, that's seen as something that you can get away with, something that won't have consequences when you say it around. Because my generation, what it's done with that word is it's gone from a word that was used to discriminate against black people to a word used in hip hop culture by black people to rather uplift our race. And now, because the way it's been, because hip hop has gotten so marginalized and mainstream and oversaturated, now our generation thinks it's okay to use that word kind of as a joke, as a meme, as something that can be played around, as something that doesn't have the meaning it used to have. And I feel like that's a very good testament to the diversity of the school and the country as a whole, because I still see that word as something that is, deeply offensive. But by the amount of times I hear it, it disassociates with me. It's hard to say that stuff like that. And it's just interesting that yet another thing from my culture is being just absolutely, taken away by white people. And then when I would be one to, get mad at it, they'd be like, it's just a word. Why are you getting so mad? And blah, blah, blah. Like, just putting it down and stuff like that. And I think, like I said, I think that's a direct consequence of the lack of diversity in some places. And you had something to say, Amy?
Well, yeah, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I'm just wondering if somebody else on the panel can answer that question. Like, how does a person step in as an anti-racist? What can you say to friends or to colleagues when they are making racist comments?
You could say that's racist.
There you go.
Tried that before.
Yeah.
But I think it's important, Tripp, that in those situations, what needs to happen in that moment is it needs to be a white person that says to that white person, that's racist. It needs to come off it needs to not be your job in that moment. It needs to be, we talk a lot about bullying and bystanders and, and the role of the bystander. In that moment, it's so incredibly important that a white person checks that white person and is like, I'm sorry, you can't say that. That's racist. And explicitly calls it what it is. And the more that happens, and the more that young white people understand that, and they can help other young white people understand that, the less time you are being impacted by that person's lack of understanding.
And to that point, Lithea, I think that goes back to, it is our job as white folks to educate ourselves. How many people know what the history is of that word, right? And if you knew what the history of that word was, you would be able to step in comfortably and speak to it.
Absolutely.
I think the approach that I try to take is just a lot of I try to reflect my own experience. So you can absolutely say to someone, hey, that's racist. And I think it depends on the relationship that you have with that person, the level of trust. And because I've done a lot of work with a faculty with different levels of trust, you don't want to shut people down, even though you should be able to say that's racist to everybody. But I think something that I do a lot is, I say, hey, I heard that you just said that. I think something that I've thought about a lot is that in the past I've thought this and then I realized this, and sort of offering like a little bit of hey, I've been through this journey and I want to walk through this with you. I want to become anti-racist with you. And I don't know. I mean, it depends, because there's definitely things that people who are really close to me that have said, and I've been like, don't say that. Don't use the phrase illegal alien. That's inappropriate. You don't, but it depends on who the person is. And I think with students as well, working in a classroom with 8th graders, doing that same kind of thing of like, oh yeah, I've thought about that. And here's a mistake that I've made, or here's a thing that I've had, and how can we move through that together?
So is that Graysen? I'm sorry.
Yeah. Sorry, I just wanted to touch on that. I think that schools nationwide, just having social media, I'm more aware of the outside world. And I think culturally, places that don't have a lot of Black culture, or just African Americans, if there's one African American in that whole school, they are immediately considered popular or cool. And I think the youth likes to embrace their culture, but doesn't like to embrace the people and the respect that comes along with that. I think that there's a lot of disrespect around that, and people will argue, oh, what's the issue? Like, we just want to, it's like, it's our choice. We can do this. We can get this hairstyle. We can say this word. It doesn't mean anything, but really not understanding what it means just in the broader picture. And I think that as a youth and as a culture, that's a point that we need to touch on. Just the sensitivity around that, and being more respectful. I'm constantly, as a white person, checking myself and making sure, oh, is this respectful what I'm doing? Is it respectful what I'm saying? Am I approaching this situation in the correct way? And I think that's something that we all need to be aware about.
Thank you, Graysen.
Mm-hmm.
Amy?
I have just to follow up on that, to Tripp's point about the N-word in music. As a musician, John, I'm wondering if you could speak to that at all. John here?
Hi, yeah, sure, I'd be happy to. I listened to Tripp, and without knowing you, Tripp, I feel like I know you. Our experiences are probably more similar than dissimilar. And part of that, in my youth, I used the N-word. I put it in music. I thought that I was taking the word and transforming it into something else, and using it as a term of endearment, and something that only I and we could say amongst ourselves. And there was, in fact, I argued against, argued for the right to use that word against Professor Cornell West when he came to our high school when I was 15 or 16 years old. And it wasn't until I was convicted of that first time nonviolent offense. And I went in and through the prison system, the federal prison system in America, that I stopped using that word, and I stopped putting it into music, and I stopped investing in a belief that we could somehow take the pain from that word and either absolve ourselves or our enemies. And that just didn't make sense to me anymore, especially when I felt what it was like on a very, very visceral level to be a nigger going through the federal prison system. So I distanced myself from that. It's not a part of my music. That said, when others use it, I don't say to my peers, my contemporaries, that they shouldn't use it. I also think that, you know, for me to suggest to anyone that something that's working for me ought to work for everyone is absolute hubris and arrogance, and that's not it at all. I think that you know, I listen to and appreciate music that has that word, but I don't say it. I don't play that music for or in front of my daughter or other young people, and I think that says a lot. Any type of energy that I can't bring around my family, that I have to censor, it feels duplicitous to me. It feels disingenuous. So I know that that's like the Twinkie versus the wholesome piece of fruit, meaning you know, there's nothing real good waiting for me on the other side of using that word or experiencing that word. The first time somebody ever called me a nigga was in New Hampshire when I was 14 years old, getting ready to cross the street. I didn't know what that felt like until that moment. So it's very, very complicated. I completely agree with Mathea in that when those injustices happen in public spaces, that the last thing that I want to do as a person of color is be the North Star, the moral authority for the group, because I've got to do it again and again. It's exhausting. It's absolutely exhausting. And then I start to think to myself, well, you know what, it's just me. And then I start to feel worse about myself. So I'd rather just distance myself from that altogether. So when there is a person who happens to be a white person who knows that a violation has been committed, man, you know, I implore anyone and everyone who's on this call and who will share it, you stand up, you do the right thing, because it's worth it. And just because a person of color might not object to something doesn't mean that it's not objectionable.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you a lot. Just what you were saying at the end there, I've always, like, you really just changed my perspective a lot in what you just said, because I've always seen it that I've always seen that it's somehow, you know, my responsibility to, though I want to be an ally and though I want things to change, it was my responsibility to change, you know, problems facing my race. I had to always be the one that confronted it. I had to be the one that made it, you know, a big deal, even though my friends are like, who cares about it? But yeah, being able to, you know, hold others accountable is something that I really wish was, you know, a common theme in a lot of my friend groups. And some it is, and some it's just not. Like, I can't tell you how many times I've just been maybe, you know, playing an online game with my friends or just talking with some random people, and then just to have somebody, you know, walk in, hear my voice, call me the hard R, and then just, like, you know, move on like nothing happened. Like everybody does that. And when I myself get outraged that happened, having my friends say, you can't get mad every time this happens. That's, it's gonna happen. And I get it. Like, especially on the internet, it's so much easier to be racist and hurtful and hateful when you have that whole screen of total anonymity. They don't know your name. The only thing they're hearing is your voice. You could be anywhere. The only thing you're hearing is your voice. And after that, it's like you never, unless you add them, you're never going to hear from that person ever again in your life, probably. So it's just, I think it's just absolutely crazy how things go down, how my culture and my generation has shaped what what nigga means. And I'm thankful that you told me that, because I feel like those words are going to help me go on the right path and maybe see who I call a friend and who I don't call a friend in the future. So thank you for that. Thank
you. So we're coming down to the end of our timing here, and there are so many great questions and comments in the chat that it's very difficult to try to navigate, but also make sure we ask them so that the conversation can continue a natural flow. There was an incident that occurred recently that keeps being brought up in the chat that we would be remiss not to address, and I'm just going to read it as it was written. There's a comment about, what about when the 19-year-old kid told a 67-year-old racist to stop, and he gets punched in the face for speaking up, and then that 67-year-old white man who started the violence sits in his car while a young black man is immediately arrested for responding to the white man's violence with his own violence, and throwing a rock and being immediately handcuffed while it took 10 minutes for the police to get the white man out of his truck and handcuffed. For many of you, for those of you that are not familiar with this incident, it occurred, unfortunately, at the Five Corners protest the day before, and certainly has sparked a lot of concern and conversation. And I'm not, obviously wasn't there to participate in the protest, but there seemed to be a lot of interpretations of what occurred. And so to address this, I think it makes most sense to start with Mathea and Graysen, if you want to touch on it. Eric, if you want to touch on it from the process and the protocol that law enforcement had to follow in order to make that arrest, and the difference, if any, between the young man that was detained after, what happened, and, just kind of anything that we should know, clarifying question or clarifying information based on your understanding from a law enforcement perspective. So with that, I'm just going to toss it over to you, Mathea, to address it however you feel. If I unmute you, there you go.
I was not there at that point. I left a little before that. It was really hard to leave. It was still going, and people were still, it was such an incredibly powerful moment. I organized a Black Lives Matter march a few years ago, right after Philando Castile was killed. And I think we had like 80, maybe 100 people come. It was the middle of the summer. It was a really hot day, but there were 400 plus people at this event. And it was massively different. It felt very different. And it was unbelievable. And I wanted to stay the whole time, but in the back of my mind, I'm going, COVID, we're extended exposure. We're all out here together, and yes, you have your mask on, but I have people in my life that I care about that I need to protect also. So I left. So I think it's probably more up to Graysen and Eric to talk about it. I think the problem that I had mostly was the times, some of the way it was represented initially in the paper was really frustrating, kind of played right into that narrative of, I think the headline was like vigil ends in violence, and it was like, no, that's not what happened. There was an incident that took place at the end of one of the most peaceful, most beautiful protests I've ever been a part of, and I've been protesting since I was, in third grade. So I think for me, that was the really hard part about it, was that, you know, we want to be Martha's Vineyard, we want to be different, we want to hold ourselves up to a higher standard, and yet that just got right in. Thankfully, they saw, you know, they heard us. I think both Graysen and I both kind of reach out to them and we're like, no, that you can't, that's not right. And they changed it. But I think all in all, it was an incredibly peaceful, an incredibly beautiful day. And I'm interested, I'd like to hear from law enforcement about, you know, why did it go down? I don't know anything about policing. I don't know anything about why that happened. And I'd be interested to hear that as well.
Yeah, I'd be interested to hear from law enforcement as well. But I was leaving when the incident happened. And I did see the whole thing. It was confusing to me because I had put together such a beautiful thing and then something like that happened. And my mom was telling me to get in the car. This is not what we came here for. This is not what we fought for. This is not your message. And although I believe that, I thought it was my duty to stay and record it in case something did happen. And people were sitting in front of the truck. People were surrounding it. I thought that it was interesting for me to watch because the Tisbury Police Department was overwhelmingly helpful in putting this together. But then the man sat in his truck for that long, and I don't know why that happened. There may be reasons, but I don't think it was correct. And I don't know if they would have made that arrest if the crowd hadn't been so overwhelming. And just about the Times article, for me, that if it bleeds, it leads, you know, that it was honestly heartbreaking putting together something so beautiful and feeling that emotion and that unity, especially during the kneeling, and then having it overshadowed by something that was just too not. The protester should have done what he did. He stood up to a man who was yelling the N-word and giving protesters middle fingers. Like, it was completely unacceptable, but I don't think it should have shadowed that much on our protests. And I am grateful that the caption changed. But I think that's what's happening around the nation also. Like, these riots, people are turning these protests into such negative things because of these riots and looting. But the protesters are protesting peacefully. Half of these riots aren't even done by them. And I think it's easy for us to take away from the message of it all by trying to highlight something that's negative. When all these people are doing is just trying to stand up for what they believe in and stand up for their rights. And I believe that incident was unfortunate, but it by no way governed or defined what we did that day. And it was handled accordingly in the end. And I think that I hope that my message is heard in the end and that does not shadow it.
I'd just like to add on what Graysen was saying real quick. I was also at the protest and I witnessed what happened myself in my own eyes as well. I did not read the newspaper article that was on it, but hearing about it, that disturbs me as well, because I thought that the protest was a beautiful thing. What was going on was really important. And for what Graysen said, for that to be overshadowed was really too bad. And I want to, put some attention into the man that threw the rock through his window after that 67-year-old man was saying the racist comments and flipping everybody off. I think that is a prime example of what something that Dr. Martin Luther King was really saying, that only love can do that. Because of that, I know he came through with it with a really good cause and was doing it because he was angry, and it's okay to have those angry feelings towards people. But when you do an act like that, it builds up the situation and makes it a lot bigger. It takes away from what's going on as we saw it. And just going back to also what Graysen was saying about the looting and the rioting, just doing all that is other ways to just take away from the protests that are going on, because more fear is created, more people are able to take advantage of what's going on, the chaos in the nation. And I feel that in order to have a successful protest, like without any, things like that, that even when protesters are faced with very, angering circumstances, that it's hard, and it's something that we've been discussing earlier about being hard to, constantly do, but taking that moral high ground, and saying, just because you're being hateful towards us doesn't mean that we're going to be hateful in the same way back to you. We're going to, get you guys to change in our own way, instead of just, throwing back, destroying stuff, calling out people that don't deserve to be called out. And I just thought it was really interesting how we saw all of that spread, especially into a place like Martha's Vineyard, because I wasn't expecting anything to happen like that at the protest, and yet it did. And I think it's a really interesting testament about how, the violence that's being insinuated in some of these protests is affecting how things are going around the entire country. So yeah, thank you for pulling that up.
Thank you, Tripp. and thank you to everyone who participated on our panel this evening, and to all of you who joined us. There are so many amazing comments and questions in the chat, and it's very clear that, we are going to be able to effectively put out a series of dialogues and opportunities for us to convene and communicate as a community. And that's wonderful. But by no means, this is just the beginning of the conversation. The work is ongoing. It's a work in progress, as we know. And, it's just great that we've been able to start the dialogue. And, one of the things we wanted to make sure people walked away from tonight with was something tangible, something that they could do immediately to get involved, to support, to feel like they're contributing to bringing forth the kind of change that we are all collectively invested in, need to be collectively invested in seeking. And so I just want to ask the panelists really quickly to go around and just, give that one suggestion of, something that, a participant can walk away here tonight to do, to read, to think about, to reflect upon, whatever the case may be. And why don't we start with, I'd like to end with our students, because, and you guys have been so remarkable, and I'm not shocked because you're students, you're remarkable just as human beings, and your insight has been eye-opening for me, and I'm sure everyone else on the call. So let's start with you, Chief Blake, and we'll end with our students.
I want to give a 10-second dissertation on what we were talking about before, about how I feel. I didn't read the police report, and I read the paper, but I think it was Graysen that said that she was very confused when it went down. Well, it's the officer's job at that point to unconfuse it and find out what happened. In Massachusetts, a simple assault and battery, unless it's witnessed by the police officer, is not arrestable. Right? So smashing the window out of a car is arrestable. So I believe the older gentleman got arrested as well because he became disorderly, and he was charged with disorderly and assault. Sometimes it takes a little while to vet those things out and come down to what actually happened. But some things that you would think were like immediately arrestable just aren't. And we want officers operating within the scope of the law at all times. So if it took a little bit of time to find out what happened and then get enough probable cause to make a good arrest, then I think that's a good job. But I haven't read the police report, and I wasn't there. But from the outside looking in, kind of that's what I have to say about that. The one thing I could say you could leave this with is, if you aren't registered to vote, why aren't you registered to vote? And if you haven't done your census, why haven't you done the census? Very important things. And remind everybody to register to vote. I am not going to get political, but it is time for a 2008 insurgence of the African American community and the white community to vote get out and vote and let your voices be heard. There's no more losing the popular vote, but winning the election. So it's very, very important. That's what I have to say. Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, there's so many things to do, but the one thing that I would say to do for white people is figure out the next step of educating yourself on yourself. And the one I would think, the resource that I would suggest right now, Ibram Kendi, who wrote the book How to Be an Anti-Racist, was recently interviewed by Brene Brown on her podcast Unlocking Us, and it's about an hour long. It's an amazing introduction, to his work, and also just to some ideas that probably there's call already have done a lot of this thinking. I listened to it, and I've been doing this thinking for years, and it furthered my thinking. So that would be the one thing that I would suggest.
Thank you, Amanda. Thea.
Yeah, I love Dr. Kendi's work, so I would also say that's a really good place to start reading. I can't read enough. There's so much to read. There's so much to pay attention to. I think listening to Black activists, listening to trans activists, thinking about designing from the margins, meaning when you're putting something together, who is the person most marginalized, and what do they need in order for your system to work? And if you think about them when you're designing your system, if you make it work for the most marginalized person, then it's going to work for everybody. Then everybody's going to benefit. So designing at the margins, making sure there's, that's where you're coming from. And I would also just say that it's to be ready for it not to end. Be ready for it to be something that you are going to do forever. And if you are okay with that, then you have, then the work is there for you to do. And you're not going to reach a place of, oh, I'm done now. I heard someone recently saying that anti-racism is like an alcoholic, right? Alcoholics in recovery always refer to themselves as alcoholics, right? They are alcoholics forever. And the minute they think that they're not an alcoholic anymore, well, that's when they can mess up and start to use again. So really thinking about yourself as this is not something you just overcome one day, or that one day it's all going to be better. This is a life's work, and that's okay. And we can all do that.
Thank you, Mathea.
I think to speak out specifically to white people, the thing that you can do, I actually had a different idea what I'd say when I first started this after hearing what a lot of you guys have had to say, the questions have been coming in. I think something you can do is, advocate for your African-American peers, advocate for people that are going through struggle. Education is really important. Understanding what's going on is extremely important, but the best thing you can do is actually to advocate for these people by speaking up for their rights, making sure you go to protest, making sure you get your voice heard, because as yourself, as just one person, it's really hard to get those ideas out. But when you have a bunch of people at a protest, or a bunch of people signing a petition or donating, it can really, move on. So use the power of people that have the same ideas of you and have the same values as you, and use those to better this country for Black people and for everybody in themselves as well. So just make sure you do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Tripp. And Graysen?
I just think thinking each day, what are you doing to help other people? I think since the protest, I've been making it a daily routine or a daily requirement to sign another petition, to reach out to another people, to brainstorm another idea of how to help. And as MLK said, life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are we doing for others? And I think that's something we need to constantly think about, and just not wasting your energy in places that don't matter. You can't talk sense into crazy or ignorant. And I think I've experienced, although with the positive, I've experienced negative comments too. And just not putting your energy into those, letting people educate themselves on their own, and hoping that they'll come to that light, and just looking at the bigger picture of it and trying to do something each day to work towards a better and brighter future.
Thank you, Graysen. And thank you guys all again for joining, first for giving us their time and sharing their perspectives. I'm going to turn it over to my partner in crime, Amy Lilavois, to close us out for the evening. Thank you all again.
Great. So just two things I want to say before we close it out, to follow up on Bethea and Ibram X. Kendi. He's also collaborated with Jason Reynolds, who's an African-American YA author, and they've taken a 500-page book by Ibram Kendi called Stamped and made it into a YA novel. It's much simpler text, much simpler to understand, and brilliant. And it's the history of racism and anti-racism. So I highly suggest that to every educator, every parent, every kid on this Zoom right now. And for me, you know, I think it's about making a promise, you know, starting right now, as soon as we get off this, to acknowledge where we see problems and call out racist behavior. For the Tripps of the world and the Dakirs of the world and the Johns of the world. It's our place to do that. And it's not gonna feel good, and it's gonna be scary. And vulnerability doesn't feel good, but to Amanda's point about Brene Brown, vulnerability is important to move forward, and we need to do that. I agree with Dakir. I thank all the panelists. You know, I'm so appreciative and inspired by this, and we wanna do more. We started the ball rolling, and I don't think we're going to stop now. So we will be back in touch when we plan another forum. If anybody has any ideas for us, please reach out. Bethea can be reached through the charter school website. Dakir and I can be reached through the Vineyard, the regional high school website. Graysen, thank you, thank you, thank you. Tripp, thank you, thank you, thank you. Congratulations, Tripp. We'll see you July 22nd, July 26th for graduation. All right. Thank you, everybody.